Can I move this a little bit?
Yeah.
I just need
there so that you can maybe see us a little bit.
Oh, okay.
But he's not, I don't know if he can see us.
Okay.
Actually, I'm not sharing my screen with him so he can't see.
Will this bother his camera?
No. It's more that I'm trying to figure out.
Welcome, everybody. I think we're ready to get started. Oh, it looks like one more person's coming in. Yeah. Hi. Okay. So I'll give the last people a little bit of time to settle down. All right. Welcome. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you all here to this kind of collective event where we can remember and think and thank John. I was not one of John's students. I'm just going to make sure I have some words I want to read in a minute. I was not one of John's students, but if you think of your advising relationship as a parental relationship, a familial relationship, I should say. John would probably not approve of this, but this is how I thought of it. John was very good friends with my advisor. So I think of John as sort of my academic uncle. I met him my first year of graduate school. And some of the people that I started graduate school with were very much in John's orbit. And in many ways, John sort of loomed large. In his person, he stitched together my understanding of the networks that sustained the kind of French history that I was interested in and wanted to do. So I recognize that many of you here probably even knew John much better than me. But there might be people who didn't. And so I'm going to say a few words about John in a more general sense and not very many personal things. And I'll leave that to the people on the panel who I will introduce one at a time as we go. So until his death last year, John Merriman was the Charles Seymour Professor of History at Yale University. And he was a beloved teacher. He was a generous colleague, a mentor to many, and a prodigious researcher and scholar. We don't need to dwell on the quantification, but I'll just say that he published 10 books in French and European history, co-editing 6 others. And when he died, he had just finished the manuscript of an 11th book. He was born in Michigan, in Battle Creek, and he grew up in Portland, Oregon. And he received his BA and his PhD in history at the University of Michigan, where I teach. Did I say who I am? My name's Joshua Cole. I teach it. My name's Joshua Cole. I teach history at the University of Michigan. So it was actually kind of a big deal for us, too, in my department, and we talked about it and noted it. His work really embraced the teaching of social history as it was practiced by his mentor and his advisor, Charles Tilly. And let me just say a few words, and of course all of you know this, but I'm just going to say it because I think it has to be said. Central to John's work was a commitment to the stories of those whose voices are absent or hard to find in the written record. And he specialized in the history of protest movements, particularly those of working people, working men and women. And he celebrated their successes with the same verve that he brought to documenting the powerful forces arrayed against them. The titles of his books give you a sense of the flavor of his writing: The Agony of the Republic, The Red City, The Margins of City Life, The Ballad of Anarchist Bandits, The Dynamite Club. his drive to bring these stories to light, I'm not going to go into it. There are so many stories about John and how many archives he visited, and I'll just say that we have probably, many of us have had the experience of going to an archive fresh in the morning, ready to go, and finding that John was already there. So John's support for his younger colleagues was, in my experience, both instant and unending. And when I say instant, it began as soon as you met him. He wanted to know what you were interested in and what you were working on. And then every time you crossed paths with him later, he was checking in. He would want to know what's going on, and he would ask questions, and he would tell you where the best new place to eat lunch across the street from the archives. I mean, it was unending in that sense. And as Sarah and I were talking about it yesterday, Sarah Farmer, what made it most remarkable was the fact that John, just because of who he was, treated everybody as an equal. Even the undergraduates in his course who were nervously writing their first papers about French history. And by the way that he sort of invited you in, he made it seem like you could do this too. So I'm going to save it for the others to talk about all the other aspects of John's life, his love of Balazouk, of his adoptive French village, his family, and his friendships. But I just, he's wearing the Michigan hat here. I just want to conclude that I worked with John a lot in the last decade because he became a mentor to me as I became a co-author of a textbook, and he was very generous. We shared an editor at Norton, and I couldn't have done it, and I wouldn't have done it without his support and help. But I think he may have been a little bit disappointed that the person who ended up teaching French history at the University of Michigan didn't care that much about basketball or football. And he would often come by, and he was generous. He would stop by and say hello, and we would have coffee together. But there was something kind of telling about it. He knew one day while we were talking, I don't know, John didn't boast very often. Wasn't in his character, except maybe occasionally about how many departmental archives he visited. But like boasting wasn't kind of part of his personality. But one day as we were having coffee just a few years ago, he told me in a quiet voice that he was very pleased that there was still a photograph of him in the student athletic building in Ann Arbor because he won the Intramural Athlete of the Year award as an undergraduate. And I don't know how many people he told that. I wasn't surprised to hear it, but I liked hearing it, and I thought maybe that as we gathered here to remember him and to enjoy the memory of the things we learned from him, that he might also have enjoyed me telling you that at the end. So, yes, thank you, John. I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details about their many, many accomplishments. I'm just going to say where they're from. So our first speaker in alphabetical order is Jennifer Boittin, who teaches French history at Penn State University. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Yeah, let's start. We decided we were going to start with John because John Monroe is at Iowa State University, and we'll begin with him because, yeah. So have you been able to hear me, John? Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Oh, and we can hear you too. That's great.
We can hear you and see you.
Thank you.
All right.
So go ahead.
Okay, here goes. So I don't know if the program has any information about what we were going to present on or what we said we would present on, but that's all right if it doesn't, because I should note at the start here that I decided to actually change the topic of my remarks from what I initially proposed. And really, rather than proposing fresh research here, I'm going to talk about John's approach to graduate advising, because I think, especially sort of at the spot the field of the profession is in, I think it might be just a useful, it might be useful as a pedagogical example and maybe even a kind of historical case study to kind of lead the record. Anyone who's heard me talk about being a student of John's over the years might remember that I've tended to stress the extent to which his approach involved very little explicit intervention into the genesis or development of his students' PhD theses. Indeed, over the course of my time working with it, it came to seem as if a capacity to do that sort of hard conceptual work independently was in fact one of his key prerequisites for accepting some of his students. With physical 20-something myopia, I remember being frustrated by John's so-keep-book approach to we call it that. Coming up with everything on my own, after all, was really hard work. But looking back on it now, though, I have a different view. The reasoning skills, the lonely struggle of finding a topic, conceiving a chapter outline, working out a theoretical framework to accommodate my evidence, and so on, that whole lonely struggle led me to develop really invaluable skills, actually skills that proved crucial when the time came to conceive and write a second book on a very different topic. It's clear to me now that John, thinking maybe of his own experience, had that long-term goal in mind with his pedagogical approach. The plan, his plan, wasn't just to end up with a sound dissertation out of the student. It was to give the student the skills necessary to be a productive researcher over the course of an entire career. And for that, push, I'll always be grateful. In terms of actual feedback on writing, John was similarly important. He would make tick marks in the margins of draft chapters. He'd correct solecisms. His thing was that he'd rephrase any use of the French apostrophe as or of the English apostrophe as possessive with a French word. So never the bourgeoisie, always of the bourgeoisie. He found the apostrophe as attached to a French word just intolerably vulgar. John would also periodically make what I came to think of as historical reality check comments, noting some larger contextual factor going on at the same time as whatever arcane thing I was writing about at the given point in the chapter. But the one I remember was when pages deep into what I now recognize as an excruciatingly anoretic discussion of the evolution of the ideas of avant-garde, that is the father of French Spiritism, across his publications from 1857 to 1869. At a certain point in that, it was just pages and pages of discussion, John noted in the margin, hey, 1867, that's the start of the Liberal Empire. I remember thinking of that comment as pedantic, but by the time I was at the BM for my research here, starting to really go through material, learning to swim in the deep end of primary sources, at that point, the importance of, the really crucial importance of those little reality checks became clear. They represented a whole mode of thinking. They modeled a powerful intellectual technique. And in fact, it's really that what they do is pointing towards one of the fundamental gestures of historical close reading. And in fact, these days, these sorts of contextual chronological reality checks turn out to be among the most frequent comments I make in the margins of my own So there we go. Right, so at first glance, John seemed to be a very minimalistic advisor. The remarkable diversity of the work his students have produced, reflected in the publications of the participants in this roundtable, testified to that fact. He was definitely not one of those PhD advisors who sets out to create little copies of himself. And yet, over the last few months, and this is why I'm saying something different than what I initially planned, because I've been reflecting on this over the last few months, and as I've been thinking about what I say here, it became increasingly clear to me that the story is in fact much more complicated. Yes, John didn't impose topics, he didn't mandate theoretical frameworks, he didn't even suggest them, he let you do that, but he did make it absolutely, unignorably clear what interested him and what didn't. As a student of his, you absorbed this in his graduate seminar and as a TA in his courses, watching him lecture. And it's the lectures really that kept coming back to me as a kind of pedagogical example as I was thinking about these comments. Really the lectures where in a sense he was the graduate advisor by teaching undergraduates. Now, the lecture that especially I remember in this regard was one from his course on Europe from 1648 to the present, which a visit to the Yale Open Courses website reminded me is Lecture 8, the Industrial Revolution. So that lecture ends with a discussion of industrial discipline, the adversarial relationship between worker and foreman, told, of course, very much from the worker's point of view. And actually, it's told more precisely here from a young John Merriman's point of view, because the discussion hinges on his account of an industrial accident he caused by showing up at work hungover and, as a consequence, mishandling a gigantic automated boysenberry massacre during an ill-starred college summer, working at the Love, Jams, and Jellies plant in The recorded version of this anecdote is pretty restrained. It's maybe a 2-minute autobiographical excursus in a 50-minute lecture. The version I remember from when I saw him teach this lecture was considerably more expansive. It was a good 10, 15 minutes of John play-acting his younger self, play-acting his able foreman, doing Chaplin-esque pantomime work on the factory floor, milking the story for all of his words, and in the process, dissolving the entire class into anarchic, uncontrollable laughter. Industrial discipline, institutional discipline, maybe even academic discipline. All of the self-important performances of authority, deference, dominance, and submission were pummeled into irrelevance, were burst open in a gush of molten boysenberry syrup. Thinking about my dissertation and first book in light of that example, the true nature of John's influence as advisor became clearer to me. Without necessarily being aware of it at the time, and in fact, frankly, being totally unaware of it at the time, I found myself seeking out evidence that I thought he'd appreciate, that he'd find interesting, that would speak to his preference for the margins over the center, the humble over the great. For example, the thought of him as a reader shaped my whole view of mediatism in the 19th century. Because of him, I thought to dig deep into the power relation implicit in the phenomenon. It turns out that in the Second Empire France, unlike the Victorian Britain of the United States, there seems to have been at least as many men who acted in public mediums as there were women, maybe even a slight preponderance of men. I discovered this by spending many hours counting names found in various places to arrive at this conclusion. And I did this not because John told me to, but actually because I knew that was what he would want. Class-wise, the men who chose this path tended to come from the upper reaches of the working class, the ranks of skilled laborers pressed by industrialization. Which is to say, right, from John's people. I can't tell you how happy I was when I discovered that. And, I was equally happy a decade later when John actually returned the favor. He contacted me because it turns out that Emile Henry, the anarchist terrorist, explored spiritism before making his faithful turn to violence. The nature of the allure of mediums for people in marginal positions is clear. And at the time I was writing had already been explored by feminist historians. Speaking or writing for spirit, right, provided mediums an opportunity to be listened to have what they said taken seriously in a way that would otherwise have been unavailable to them in ordinary life. What I noticed in my own examination of the French case, though, was the extraordinarily high-cost mediums paid for that plot point. The uncanniness of spirit communication, their sense of unutterable provenance, depended on a perceived disjunction between the capacity of the speaker and the quality of the speech. And article spirit writing on the origins of the universe was numinous because it showed a refinement, quote, far beyond his intellectual capacity.
John, can I interrupt you? I'm sorry, since we have so many people, can you cut your comments a little bit? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
There's such a, you can't see the room.
Fortunately, I am almost done. Because what I was going to say is that, among these people, I encountered Taylor, who actually described his predicament as being very similar to the one of John in the boysenberry factory. And, I would say when I first encountered that photo 25 years ago, it grabbed me by the collar. And it did so because of John, not because of any specific task he assigned or piece of advice that he gave, but because of the overall approach he modeled. That approach involves a skepticism of hierarchy, a rigorous focus on the evidence and its context, and above all, an empathetic willingness to look at any situation from the point of view of the least powerful person involved, the person being marginalized, the underdog. The tailor who had to see Merriman while figuring out how it was going to make ends meet, the hungover college kid being browbeaten by his foreman as he tried to run the poison bear faster. Okay, hope that didn't go too long.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Maybe this is a sign that there's a lot of things we want to say about John. So because there are so many people, I'll ask everybody to stay close to our limit of about 9 minutes. Our next speaker will be Jennifer Boittin, who teaches at Pennsylvania State University.
Thank you. And I should start by saying that John Monroe is the one who first explained to me that when I entered the BNF, it would be like entering the Death Star, and he was not wrong. We also helped one another out. And also, I should say that if John were at this conference, he wouldn't be in this room. He'd be watching, what is it, Tennessee against?
Tennessee's up.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to check their phones, that would be in the spirit of John. So to honor John, I want to talk about unflattening and passion. In May of 2022, I was in the final crunch week of the page proofs of my second book, which I received when I received the news that John Merriman would no longer be the fixture he'd been since around 1974, right at the beginning, at the Westerns conferences, nor the fixture he'd been in my life for more than half of it. The burial was scheduled in New Haven early in the morning, the day after my proofs were due. I chatted with Laura, who is here with us. I don't know if everybody knows that Laura Merriman is in our front row right now, so thank you for joining us here, Laura. And she also provided this amazing photo of John behind us. It's perfect, it's perfect. So I chatted with Laura, and after about an hour, it was clear that she and Chris wanted the academic family they'd gained over the years at their sides. And I like the idea of being there too. So in the spirit of the man who slept on a bench in the Limoges train station so that he could play high-level basketball on weekends even while completing his dissertation research, or who once flew all the way from France to attend a football game at his alma mater, I hit send on the proofs at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday and jumped into my car. Enough people in this room have completed page proofs or dissertations to understand just how hallucinatory it would have felt during that drive, even if I wasn't absorbing John's absence. And some probably know how much more hallucinatory it got once I hit I-90 in Connecticut at rush hour. But the next morning, standing in the 1796 New Haven Cemetery by a plot right up against the wall, a stone's throw from Yale's Department of History, I knew it was absolutely worth it. And that was after I stayed up till 2 a.m. chatting with, maybe 3 a.m. chatting with Laura right here. The sun was upon him and us being an extended family of academic kin, siblings and cousins I met through John. It was towards the end, many of whom are in this room. It was towards the end, and we were listening to Charles Keith's moving words in John's honor, and he couldn't be here, but he's at Michigan State University, which made John so proud. Another Michigan connection, right? But I was listening to his words in John's honor on passion, on family, on how we move the people around him. And I had a sort of John epiphany thanks to Charles. All those years when people had asked me who my advisor was, they'd expressed surprise when I said I was his student. Yes, I grew up in France and spent summers at my grandparents' old farmhouse in a village even smaller than Bed-Azuc, if you can imagine. But when people have just met me and hear my American accent, they don't usually know that part of my history. Instead, they know I work on gender and sexuality and race. I read theory and not just Marx. I work not only on, but in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. Plus, my overall style isn't quite like John's. Even I had sometimes wondered how we'd manage to fit one another, but as I listened to Charles talk about John, it clicked into place. My work is all about passion, literally in my second book. And he was a passionate man, the kind who would notice his undergrads might be about to fall asleep and run up to a blackboard, kick one foot off it to spin around, and then safely land. Apparently sometimes he didn't, but I didn't witness that. He once fell off a stage. But to safely land to wake everyone up. The kind who told a student to answer their cell phone in the lecture hall, and to explain with respect to that student's mother that they were busy in a lecture and would get back to her later, and no more cell phones ever went off in that lecture hall. You didn't fall asleep when he was your teacher, but not just because of the ways he moved physically, rather because of the ways he moved you, the passion with which he spoke of history and the fact that he told the stories of passionate people and complex people. He unflattened the archives in his research and writing and teaching and inspired us all to do the same. He cared about unflattening stories to the point of running through the streets of Paris to time an anarchist's every move. But there was something more than that that made his connection with his students, his humility. Just in my general cohort, and John referenced this, I was in conversation, John Monroe, I should specify, referenced this. I was in conversation with his advisees who worked on Southeast Asia, North Africa, the British Empire, Spiritism, and human rights in relation to war. It's not that he'd mastered all those fields, it was that he was fearless about letting you know what he didn't know. And then he'd say, well, I don't know much about the Jazz Age, but there's this good guy named Tyler out in California who wrote a great book. You should get in touch with him. Which, yes, was the seed that led me to Tyler to becoming a mentor and friend of mine. Although, first I had to figure out who Tyler was, because John also had a discomforting habit of talking about his very famous colleagues only by their first names. And as a side note, this once led me to spend 30 minutes hearing about some guy named Bob, and I kept thinking, who the hell is Bob? Until he finally let some clue slip, and I thought, oh, you mean Professor Robert Darrin. So, yes, I have felt unmoored this past year, losing first Tyler Stovall and then John Merriman, two North Stars in my career. But to return to the incongruity between John and me, Charles's thoughts made it all click that of course I was John's student. Of course we were his students. It wasn't only that John felt no need to know our fields better than we did. It wasn't only that he was a brilliant man, truly brilliant, and an evocative writer. It was that he never made you feel the weight of it. He gave us the tools and gifts of archival unflattening, humility, connecting, and passion, and trusted us to do the rest. So speaking of passion, John wasn't a fan of tristesse or maudlin affairs, another reason he might not have been here. So let me end with passionate sports watching, including at the Western, because the thing I most remember about my first meeting with John wasn't the giant Yale office in which he sat, but the giant Michigan Wolverines football poster right behind his head. I grew up watching rugby, among other sports, because I grew up in France. Thank you. I'm not alone. So I still don't really get why it takes 80 players, coaches on the field, or headphones to play a sport, but I liked that he didn't care who saw, the rugby field fans are like, we get you. But what I loved is that he didn't care. He didn't care who saw his passion for these sports in these Ivy League spaces. My own advisees, many of whom met John at the Western, know that come November, we usually have our conference in November, he'd be here, and he never stopped attending the Western. He went all the way up to Bozeman, just to be clear. He was there from start all the way until, a pandemic happened. But come game time, he'd be more accurately at the hotel bar watching football. You know that if he were here today, he wouldn't be sitting, as I said, in this panel. He'd be getting ready to watch the second round, or watching the second round of March Madness. He'd have a lot to say about Princeton's victory and what that meant for the team they beat. If you don't know about this, then look it up later. So when we walk by all those screens and passionate basketball fans this evening and in the next few days, we can add a warm internal or external toast to John, to the other joyful ways I'm sure we're all going to find of keeping him close today and in the weeks, months, and years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our next speaker is Rachel Chrastil, who teaches at Xavier University.
Thank you. So a few weeks ago, I got into a conversation with a colleague who works as the assistant registrar at my institution. He had been a history major elsewhere and wanted to share with me his passion and interest in the Dreyfus Affair. He had taken an entire class on the subject, and he knew I was a historian. I had done my undergraduate thesis on it. We both remarked how, as American high school students, we'd never heard of it at all and had to first encounter this event when we got to college. For me, it was while reading Barbara Tuchman's The Proud Tower. That's also where I first heard of the Paris Commune. What is that? So it's that moment of like, wait, what? That I can remember so clearly at multiple times during those years, high school, undergrad, graduate school. I mean, can you remember the first time that you heard of the Paris Commune, or that you realized that Napoleon III had been originally elected as president, or digging back even earlier, perhaps like Germany wasn't always a country, like what, and I can remember those moments because none of us was born with that knowledge. And it's that moment of discovery that I love about teaching the 100 level history classes. And that, I think, is also among the other things that's already been mentioned that John loved about teaching those classes. He could blow the students' minds at every turn, and he loved doing that. He never lost the sense of drama, emotion, resentment, and wonder in discussing the complex dynamics and minute telling details of French social and culture wars. Many of us have experienced, like John Monroe already told us, the Boisenberry story, the admiration, laughter, and sometimes the exasperation of TAing for John. So no, the Rolling Stones were not actually at the French Revolution. Let me break down for you the chronology of what was going on. In your discussion section, you kind of have to help them figure out what was going on. But few of us can capture his showmanship, his passion, his sheer love of the people involved. My first encounter with John, however, came through his writing, specifically through the first edition of Modern Europe, which was foundational to my understanding of the 19th century. As a sophomore in college, I was assigned to it. 2 years later, as I labored over a graduate admission essay, and I'm sitting there, and you're kind of like looking around the room, like, how am I going to write this? And my eyes went to my bookshelf, and I saw that, and I was like, oh my goodness, I am applying to work with this guy? Like, how is this ever going to happen? It was one of the many books he wrote. And that calls to mind to me two things from his work with Charles Tilly, Chuck, who would say, got a minute, write a line. I absorbed that advice, although nowadays, sadly, it's a little bit more, got a minute, write an email. And it's part of the way that I avoid the blank screen or like the stalled out morning of writing. Like, just keep writing. I've never met a problem with writing that couldn't be resolved by just keep writing, stream of consciousness, keep going. And I think that's very much coming from Merriman. The other thing I think coming from Merriman and also through Tilly is that sometimes you have to ask the really big questions. I remember that after slogging through a Tilly article in an early graduate seminar, and we were like, what are we doing with this? And he was like, you have to ask the big questions. Why was it that protest changed from this to that? And you have to figure that out, and you can figure it out. My favorite written line from John, and one that startled me at the time and stayed with me, reads as follows: "This I doubt." This was a complete sentence from John's review of Alain Corbin's Village of the Cannibals, referring to Corbin's contention that historians have conspired to cover up the bloody murder at the heart of his story. An otherwise very glowing review, but I remember that phrase so clearly, although in my memory it was actually in Peasants into Frenchmen, because I knew all the problems he had with that book. But why do I love it? Its voice, its umbrage, its engagement, its defense of our work. So not only write, but write clearly, write boldly. Don't cover up what you care about and what you really think. He said, got a minute, write a line. He said it all the time. But I will never forget that just one time in the 25 years I knew him, where he shared with me at a cafe not far from his apartment in Paris, he said, got a minute, write a line? That's also a tough way to live. And I don't think he ever let himself off the hook. So there's a website you might have seen called the Academic Family Tree, where the kinds of folks who do this kind of thing have actually traced back the lineage of PhD advisors. So to play on Joshua's earlier theme, right? If John Merriman is my intellectual father and his advisor Charles Tilly is my intellectual grandfather, Barrington Moore behind him, how far back does it go? So this is like both fascinating and utterly absurd, right? but really fun. Like, am I related to von Ranke? Is it turned? It turned out I am a seventh cousin of Hegel. And if you keep going back, though, there's these interesting connections. So like a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is a guy named Karl Gotthelf Lehmann, born in Leipzig in 1812, and he was a chemist. So, these really strange connections, it's almost as intellectually as foreign to me as like coming from Eastern European peasants. But that is what a linear family tree is for, I guess, to show you where you come from, whether you choose it or not, to help you think that you're part of something bigger, maybe, to reflect on change. I think of some of the things that I've seen just in the last 24 hours at this conference, and I think the young John Merriman, coming fresh out of the boysenberry plant, might not recognize some things about the way the profession is, and yet there are other ways that it would be very, very familiar to him. And then I recently revisited the site and found that actually there's a direct link via John, Tilly, Barrington Moore to Martin Luther. So 17 steps back. But I'm tickled by this, and it might be fun to draw some kind of connection here, but I don't imagine that lineage would have been up John's alley, right? He would have said, this is ridiculous. He was more of a fellow craftsman, a hobbyist who got to do what he loved, a passionate advocate for the underdog, a great historian, and a great friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Our next speaker is Judith Coffin, who teaches at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm going to pass you the microphone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think I was one of John's first two graduate students. My fellow graduate student was a man named Michael Burns, who wrote about the Dreyfus Affair and who was a child star in Gunsmoke. John told all of the students in all of the classes that Michael and I TA'd together about Gunsmoke, and he would find, magazines and with pictures of Michael. Anyway, so I'm the old person here, and the person I'm going to talk about is the young John. He was an assistant professor when I landed in graduate school, and I wanted to study German history or Russian history because that was about fascism and revolution. And then I heard about this, quote, young guy who does France. I heard about him first from George Chauncey, actually, who was then a South Africanist, and both George and I have changed fields. I knew at that point nothing, and I mean nothing, about French history. Nothing. But I had lived in France, and I had pretty good spoken street French, and I think my ability to swear amused John. Anyway, he took me on, and I switched. I was clueless, and that was a perfect match for his warmth and his generosity and his humanity. My French was good, but I still remember the first week of our graduate seminar, where I guess I was up because he thought I spoke French, and he gave me La République au Village and said, okay, read this, and next week you will report on it. Right? That was in the first day of the first week. And I had no idea what I was doing, and it didn't matter, as John Monroe has said. One of the things John always said was, just keep going. You just keep going, you'll get it eventually. And we went on to read in that seminar Michel Perrault, Les Ouvriers en Grève, both volumes, Richard Cobb, Les Armées Révolutionnaires, both volumes, Weber, which was a piece of cake after that, and Tilly's critique of Weber. We read Joan Scott when she was writing The Glass Workers, and we read the beginning of some of her work on gender, and I know that John was skeptical about some of Joan's theoretical moves, but he let me do whatever I wanted. And I muddled through that, and I think he muddled through that as well, with a combination of guilelessness, enthusiasm, and to be perfectly honest, we were at Yale, so there was luck. There was luck and there was privilege. He was, in any event, the most forgiving and expansive advisor. There was nothing uninteresting to him. I mean, maybe there was, but he didn't didn't really let us know. His energy was legendary. So was his appetite for hard work, although stoked always by loud rock and roll music. His skill as a writer was amazing, and even more amazing was how easy he made it seem. Above all, he was ferociously loyal to his family, to his kids, to his friends, to his students, to Michigan, and to France. I'm not sure in what order we would put those. As an historian, it's not just that he was the original archive rat, although others are talking about that. What came through was his love for his subjects, for the ordinary people, for their resilience, their politics, the seriousness of their politics, the ferocity of their resistance to authority. This was at the height of social history. We were working together, and he never would have used a term like agency. It was more like respect and solidarity and felt identification and companionship. So when for this last book I found an archive of letters to Beauvoir, I thought I'd finally found an archive that was worthy of my advisor. And I like to think that my Beauvoir book has the marks of a Merriman-like respect for those whose traces we happen upon. I think he liked it too, though of course he pointed out that I had misspelled Mitterrand. This is apparently common, I've learned, right? French people do it all the time. I think recently there was a Twitter thread where people complained about their advisors in the way that Twitter people do. That moved me to write John and to tell him just how excellent he had been, completely. For me, he was more like a big brother. He died a few months. I never got an answer to that email, and he died a few months later. I was stunned. I think a lot of us who were even very close to him. Laura was partly the custodian of the secret of how sick he was. Anyway, so when we contemplate our privileges and our luck, I count John Merriman foremost among those.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Judy. Our next speaker is Carolyn Eichner, who teaches at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Go ahead.
I was not John's student. John became a mentor to me after I was already in the middle of my career, or the early middle of my career, and he also became a friend. So in September of 2021, I wrote to John requesting a letter of recommendation for a Fulbright Fellowship. He replied the next day telling me that he was in the hospital without his computer, and thus, quote, "It will be complicated for me to send a letter." But he continued, "You should feel free to use any previous letter." So I contacted the Yale History Department office staff. After exchanging a few emails with Liza Joyner in the department, she realized that unlike most faculty, quote, John Merriman was not using the staff to send letters of recommendation on his behalf. Instead, it seems he did it himself. I cannot imagine the number of people for whom John wrote, between the legions of his former students, plus scholars like me to whom he became a mentor, later in our careers. Yet rather than relying on support staff, he handled every step of the recommendation process himself. To me, this epitomizes the ways in which John approached mentoring. Firsthand, with care, consideration, attention to detail. He was generous with his time, something that so many of us guard so closely. In fact, he was generous with almost everything. John was generous with his attention. Several years ago, I asked him to look at a book proposal I had drafted. John responded fewer than 3 days later with incisive comments, constructive criticism, and extremely useful suggestions. Plus, he was delightfully complimentary and ended with, quote, "Thanks for letting me read the proposal." He essentially thanked me for asking him to do a somewhat time-consuming favor, one that was truly beneficial to me and to my project. His generosity interwove with his seriously capacious interests. At conferences, John consistently attended his former students' panels and those of his many friends. But he also attended panels of younger scholars, going to hear new perspectives on his many interests. I remember the first time John was in the audience at a panel at which I presented. He nodded vociferously through our papers, and then later, in what was probably our first conversation, he commented enthusiastically about my paper. And clearly, since I'm retelling the story now, nearly 20 years later, his encouragement and his support really mattered. So before he wrote Massacre, The Life and Death of the Paris Commune, and by the way, today is the 152nd anniversary of the Paris Commune, so there's something very nice about that. So John, before he wrote the book, he had already had a deep and complex understanding of the 1871 insurgency. And he chose to write a commune book specifically to counter the historiographical trend that minimized the intentional and methodic nature of the French state and military's brutal suppression of the uprising. In researching Massacre, John recognized the importance of both women's participation in the insurgency and the particularly gendered nature of its repression, both of which he worked to understand and to integrate. So during this time, he and I had a number of email exchanges. And I looked back at them to prepare this memorial intervention. As in all of his scholarship, John was working to write a tale both deeply political and deeply human. He considered ideas about individual radical women and men, the broader politics on the left, and specific members of the Versailles government and their motivations. Writing of the Archbishop Darboy, who the communards took hostage and ultimately executed in the insurgency's final desperate days, John commented in the email that Darboy was, quote, pretty decent after all. So despite John's clear sympathy for the communards, he refused oversimplified good versus bad judgments. Instead, developing complex, nuanced portrayals of actors on both sides. He was interested in people, their lives, their words, their experiences. John gave voice to historical actors, to everyday people. In an email, he explained how he wanted, quote, to use these stories, people's stories, by weaving them throughout the narrative, to bring out the drama and the importance of the events. This is one of the many ways his scholarship reflected his humanity and generosity. John's commune-related emails allowed me a window into his research and writing process, which was a privilege for me. Discussions of sources, what he was reading, where he was finding it, and the things he considered in selecting particular historical actors and subjects filled the emails. But so did Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones, and a little bit of Bruce Springsteen. His enthusiasm for his beloved band was palpable. He wrote, quote, I saw Brian Jones play, with 2 exclamation points. And he was pretty surprised when he learned that I had seen the Stones more than he had. So we shared a love of Keith Richards, who I have loved since I was 12, and in the Paris Commune. But I don't like sports. Excuse me. John was reading Keith Richards' recently released autobiography, Life, at the time of our commune-related email exchange. Lamenting the decline in people buying and reading physical books, John pointed positively to the number of people reading Richards' books, which John found, quote, very moving in parts, while also commenting, quote, amazing the fucking guy is alive, really just astounding. So maybe Richard's rebellion, one quite different from that of John's historical subjects, but a rejection of norms and structures nonetheless, is part of what attracted John to this particular Rolling Stone. Maybe Richard's consciousness of his historical musical precedents, his acknowledgement of that, maybe that was part of John's love of Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones. I don't know. John discussed the challenges of appealing to a wide audience, given that Massacre was a trade book. He wanted to spread the story of the communist struggles for freedom, the government's bloody suppression of the event, and the lives and words of its participants. In making his scholarship accessible and engaging, he brought people, events, and politics to life. His success in drawing attention from multiple publics gave a significant platform to radical historical subjects with radical politics who strove to better their worlds. John's scholarship was generous. So John is the reason that Adam Gopnik mentioned my name and work in The New Yorker in his review of Massacre, which was one of the highlights of my life. John's mentorship involved friendship, discussions of restaurants and wine, and the Rolling Stones, intellectual engagement, and enthusiastic, resolute support. And it was always generous. He cared deeply for the subjects of his scholarship, his students, the people in his orbit, his family, the people he brought together. Along those lines, I thank John for introducing me to Laura in the friendship that we have, and for introducing me to Jennifer when she was his grad student, and for sparking our wonderful relationship as friends and colleagues. So I owe John much as a scholarly role model, mentor, and friend.
Thank you, Carolyn. So you'll note on the program, we're going to have a substitution. Unfortunately, 2 people who are listed on the program were unable to come because of family reasons. Darrin McMahon of Dartmouth University and Daniel Sherman of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And both of them very much expressed their regrets to me by mail, and they're here in spirit. Because that opened up a little bit of time, I asked one person to join us, Sarah Farmer, who teaches in the history department at the University of California at Irvine, is going to say a few words, and after that we have 2 more speakers.
I'm very pleased that I get a chance to speak of John. I'll keep it short, but I'll keep it appropriately short because I was an undergraduate student of John's, and I was an undergraduate at the time that Judy just evoked, and in fact, Judy and Michael Burns were my TAs. And so I sat up in the classroom, and when John would come in and he'd talk to his TAs, I would kind of listen in and look, and so I was a groupie from but they didn't know. So in any case, what I was talking to Josh about yesterday was the fact that John treated everybody, including a sophomore in college, as a colleague. And I was interested in I'd been to France, I spoke French, I was interested in French history. I decided I was going to take a year off from college and go work on a farm in the Limousin. And John Merriman, I went to tell him this, and he said, go for it. And when I came back, I had sent him an old postcard that I bought at a little shop that was actually closed, but there was some stock left. And when I came back, I saw my black and white curled postcard from the middle of nowhere in the Limousin on John's bookshelf. But in any case, I had an idea for a project that I wanted to do for my senior thesis. John totally backed me. That included going to Limoges to go work in archives. John met me there and introduced me to the various people at the archive. And when I started working on this project, he brought me an unpublished manuscript by Ted Margadant, saying, 350 pages, saying, you might want to read this, and handing me this unpublished manuscript. He treated me like a colleague. And it gave me the confidence that basically that I could do this, and that the stuff I was interested in should be pursued. And he was loyal, and he was encouraging, and he also, I realized in this conversation,
he really made a difference to me in the way that I teach. Because when I teach, the thing that I try to get across to students, and undergraduates as well as graduate students, is what you really want to get out of this, or what I want you to get out of this, is to get a better understanding of what you think is an interesting question. And John was about doing that, and he helped me do that. But he helped me develop the capacity to define for myself what would be an interesting question, and that was a really great gift. And I realized, in terms of this family tree that we're talking about, if we're talking about our lineage, that's something that has come down to me through John.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Joseph Peterson of the University of Southern Mississippi.
Thank you so much. Just so honored to get to speak of John. If I only had the chance to say one thing, it would be to affirm the personal indebtedness and legacies and influences that people have already talked about, the ways in which John was a mentor of such faith and support for the people that he took on, offering boundless support and contacts the way he did, and having confidence in his students to sink or swim. The way he lectured so dynamically, and it was such a story-driven approach. That's something that I hope to live up to in my teaching. And then on a totally different level, the example he set has already been mentioned, but of prioritizing non-academic pursuits, family, other aspects of a life well lived, right? Something that academics aren't always so good at, right? And those are the things that I would like to affirm, but I'm sure we'll continue to talk about those gifts that John gave all of us. But as for my more formal comments on John's intellectual legacy, I thought it would be interesting to talk about how John speaks to us about how to be activist scholars. That's a debate that's going on in the field right now, how to be, whether it's okay to even be presentist and activist in our work. And I was thinking about John, and it occurred to me that some of the things in the intellectual legacy that he's given are the moments that really struck me, are moments when he didn't hesitate to politicize. He didn't hesitate to draw present-day analogies, sometimes subtly, sometimes much more explicitly, political implications or presentist analogies or lessons for the present. And so I thought, as everyone in this room knows, this is a debate that is periodic, is perennial in our field, whether it's okay to make present-day analogies, to be an activist scholar, to draw politicized implications from your research. And it's a debate that's, I guess, raging in a particular way right now. And so I thought, was John an activist, right? Was John's work activist? Was John's work presentist? Could we use those terms in the best senses of those terms? And on the one hand, as we've been talking about, it seems glaringly obvious to talk about John as an activist, because he was a social historian. He was someone whose anti-establishment feelings were forceful and well-known to everybody who worked with him and learned from him. And he wasn't afraid to talk about politics in those ways. But on the other hand, it seems a little bit odd to talk about John as an activist because he bragged about not owning a cell phone. I can't really imagine him getting involved in a Twitter feud, or he was not the kind of historian that sort of felt necessary to hitch his work to the vagaries of the 24-hour news cycle or publish public-facing op-eds all the time. So for me, it's a question, right? To what extent was John's work public-facing and presentist and activist in these ways, right? Let me just mention two examples of what I would call good presentism in John's work. And without getting into the whole details of the debate about presentism, I'll just say that I don't mean, I'm drawing on David Armitage and David Bell and some other people here, but I don't mean that John anachronistically projected present-day values, we all know that's a no-no, right, into the past. I mean the good and necessary kind of presentism that first works to understand the past on its own terms and then brings lessons back, as another scholar, I think, put it. And the first example I want to note is in Dynamite Club, which many of you probably know. John, at first subtly, but then much more explicitly in the introduction to the paperback version, suggested an analogy between Émile Henry, this anarchist bomb thrower, and modern so-called Islamist terrorism. Right? This is a very provocative and I would say debatable analogy, right? Whether that can be drawn. What can this embittered fin de siècle alienated actor tell us about 21st century Islamist political violence? Don't the many differences between these two contexts outweigh the similarities? Well, John, in that introduction, carefully draws both some differences and some similarities to make this comparison. And I think his biggest argument is provocative, but I think it's unavoidable. He says the most striking similarity, I think, between the two moments of terrorism is that the kind of individual lone act of terror by an alienated actor like Émile Henry is often a response to much greater state violence, right? Is often a response to and locked in a kind of violent dialectic of escalation with the exponentially greater scale of violence that the bourgeois liberal state perpetrates against ordinary people, quote unquote. And so throughout that book, John really artfully juxtaposes Henri's radicalization with the ways in which the state is engaged in slow violence, as we would say today, against ordinary people. And so it's a genuinely radical move, I think, where John uses Henri's story to imply that terrorism is in the eye of the beholder, and that seemingly liberal nation states are capable of dispensing levels of terrorism no lone terrorist could ever dream of, and that state terror, for example, I think John explicitly says this, as perpetrated by the U.S. in Iraq, only feeds and creates more opportunity for terrorist response. That is one of the lessons of the book, and it's one I think that John did not force upon the historical data, but in some sort of anachronistic way, but a lesson that arose out of that data. Good presentism. The other example I want to remember and note is an insight of John's that I've often thought about and that I thought was really striking, and it comes from something he said about the 2014 book Massacre. John says in that book, in the acknowledgments, that one thing that interested him in the story of the Commune's repression was a photo he saw of elegant upper-class Parisians returning and touring the city in their top hats and jackets, strolling and gawking at the destroyed buildings, seemingly totally happy with the violent repression of Bloody Week, the death of around 15,000 Parisians. And John gave a book talk, and I remember this, about Massacre. And if I recall the talk correctly, he talked about this or a similar image of top-hatted figures posing or walking in front of bombed-out or burned-out buildings, almost as if the triumphant bourgeois were touring their destruction and their triumph. And John described the ideological function of a photo like this, of returning bourgeois to the destroyed city. He described it this way: the precious property. Oh, the poor property. That's what John said. In other words, this image was sort of representative of the bourgeois capitalist view of the world, that property is more important than people's lives, right? And this really stuck with me because when that book was published and when John gave that talk, it was just after the police killing of Michael Brown in 2014 in Ferguson. And then there were protests, of course, and revelations of long-standing police abuse of that community, slow violence against that community. And yet, depending on which news outlet you watched, you were not likely to see images of that violence. You were not likely to see images of state violence against black bodies. Instead, you were likely to see images of what? Of a looted convenience store or something, the precious property. Not the lives, the poor property. And I don't remember if John explicitly made that comparison, but it was suggested, and it was there. And to me, that's a historical insight that, again, an analogy between two situations that are very different in one way. The repression of the commune, the repression of people of color in this country, and the ways in which people are trying to protest against that systemic violence and racism. And yet, to me, there's a clear thread between the way the bourgeois propaganda tries to discredit, in a sort of property fetishizing way, those protests, right? That's another bold, presentist analogy. So just two really thought-provoking moments of good presentism, good political insight, I think, that doesn't do violence against the past, but better understands the past and the present. I'm sure there are others in John's work that we could talk about. Do I have one more minute? Because the truth is, and others have talked about this already, if we're going to talk about John as an activist and John as a presentist in the best sense of that word, actually the totality of John's work tips the other way, doesn't it? It's not so much about similarities between the past and the present, like those two examples I just gave. It's more about differences between the past and present. It's more about the ways in which the past is not like the present. That was certainly the weight of his work tended in that direction. Isn't that the meaning of perhaps John's favorite Charles Tilly quote, "It's bitter hard to write the history of remainders." Bitter hard to remainders, right? John's love, his first love and his main subject was not historical movements that had won, right? Was not historical movements that persist into the present, that have triumphist teleologies, that have analogs in the present. His first love were history's losers, so to speak, but those movements and phenomenon and protests and people who show contingency and show pathways and possibilities that weren't taken. The Demoiselles of the Ariège, the Montagnards of 1848, Émile Henry and other anarchists of the 1890s that show possibilities, that show alternate futures, as we say today, right? And so if I'm thinking of John as an activist, it's not just that he was willing to look at the distant mirror and make, as one writer called it, and make present day analogies. It's also that he was willing to look at the foreign country and see that there were other possibilities, right? And to look for those revolutionary possibilities.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much for that. Our last speaker today is Miranda Sachs, who teaches at Texas State University.
So I'm not hypothetically, but I'm also John's last, well, Joe and I and another student are basically John's last students. We sort of all graduated within the last year or so. So interestingly, I also was thinking a lot about the past and the present and the way that they flow together. So this July, I was sitting in the Croix in Lyon. I was in an apartment, and I was, to pick up what Jennifer was talking about, I was dealing with my proofs, and I was reading over my acknowledgments, and it was July, so John had passed away, and I was having to rewrite my acknowledgments to make them not the present, but the past tense. And that was really hard. That was the moment when the fact that John was not there really hit me. And actually my last conversation with John was about the fact that I was going to go to Lyon. And, I'd only really been briefly once, and it was a place he talked about a lot. And so he was telling me where to go and where to eat, gave me all these names. That's another thing we haven't talked about so much. John always knew where to eat wherever you went in France. And so this sort of process of writing, you guys know, and while I was there, I really wanted to email him, and Carolyn kind of talked about this. John would get back to you immediately. If you emailed him, you knew that the next time you checked your email, there would be a response in your inbox. And if you wanted a letter of recommendation, it would be there within 24 hours. You would not have to John was not an advisor you had to chase around. That was the one thing about the job market that you could take for granted. Anyway, so just thinking about this sitting there and writing the acknowledgments and trying to write about John in the past got me sort of thinking about this fluidity between the past and the present, and I think the way that John sort of operated and the way that he taught his students. So it's interesting that Joe decided to talk about this. And one of the things and ways I think that John taught us to think about this is about space. John spent a lot of time in the archive, but he also spent a lot of time wandering and following around these people, and when he was teaching us, the students, and we were TAing about Émile Henry, he would say, I've been to the Café Terminus, I've been to all these places that he's from. And as someone who studies urban history and also really loves cities, I really appreciated that methodology. And so, the fact that at 5 p.m. when the archive closed, walking around the city was a form of research, right? And it was an absolute delight. It was what I wanted to be doing, but it was also a way that I could learn. And it was a way to think about, if these children lived here and they got this far, how far would that have been? How far, how long would it have taken them to walk? With the commune, this is where this church was. This is where this church was. Anytime I I walk around Paris, I think about these different locations where various people in the commune were, the Jardin Luxembourg, where, this guy, because he finds this guy he knows, he gets out, right? There's the map of Paris, the map of these spaces. It's so present because that's how John thought about doing research, is you really had to know the spaces. You had to be there. So I think that was something he very much passed on to us as students. I also remember when he was teaching, he would refer to a city, and he'd say, that's like La Rochelle, that's my 12th favorite city. This is my whatever. There was a list. There was a list. And then I eventually was like, what is your favorite city? Well, Paris, of course. I was implied, obviously. It's like, oh, good, because it's mine too. So that was one thing, is just sort of getting to know the spaces and being present in there and thinking about, you are there in the 21st century, but these people were there in the past, and we got to get a sense for the places that they lived in. And another story that came to mind to me, we've talked a lot about archives, is a story John told a lot with teaching. So there's one time he was in the archive, and he calls up a box, and he opens the box, and there's a glasses case in the box. And he says, oh, what idiot left their glasses case in this archival box? And then he opened the glasses case and had the name of an optometrist in New Haven. Yeah. So John literally put himself in the archive inadvertently, right? So there was this fluidity between the past and the present. The archive was so, visceral, so present, that he actually wound up in this particular archive, right? And Josh talked about everybody finding him, so that I thought about that story. And I think all of us have talked about just how much the John students are people who work very closely with archives, looking for these stories, looking for the stories of people who might not be easy to find. And that's, I'm a historian of childhood. Children are, notoriously hard to find in the archive. And, I just did research because that's what we were told to do, is just sit in that archive day in and day out. And it wasn't because John said you must do it. It was just like, that's what you do, right? That's how you do history, is you just kind of sit in there until you find the stories. And so the final thing I'll say is my first chapter was 70 pages. The first time I had it, which I think a lot of people, their first chapter is a little long. And I gave it to John, and again, the sort of light touch came back to me. He said, there's this story in the middle that's really interesting. It's a father who's trying to get his son into the workforce. You should start the chapter with that story, right? Like this is the story that's the people that's really interesting. And I wound up doing that in my dissertation, and then I wound up looking into this family, and it turns out there was so much more. They were, one of them had fought in World War I, and they were Eastern European Jews, and one of them died in the Holocaust, right? He had this nose for this is a story. This is this story in the archive is going to be the one that, is the one that we can connect with in the present. These are these people who do have this sort of thing that we can build empathy from. So I think that is the way that I was thinking, is, again, the sort of fluidity between the past and the present, and really being able to relate to the past and understanding the past, kind of what Joe was saying. So that's where I will end.
Thank you. So we have plenty of time for comments and questions from the audience. We have 30 minutes left. This is being recorded, and so if you wanted to speak, it would be nice to speak into a microphone. There's a microphone at the back of the room where we can pass this one up as well. Or I guess I could save this if anybody wanted to respond. Does anybody want to say a word or two? Feel free. Jeff, here comes the mic.
This has been a great panel to remember a great human being, somebody we all miss. But I have to say, it's fascinating for me to listen to more about John the intellectual, because that wasn't the basis of our relationship. I first met him in 1994, and I think almost every conversation we ever had was about college basketball. The only time I really remember having a long conversation about our work was about Dynamite Club, and because I was teaching a class on terrorism, and he was trying to convince me to use Dynamite Club. And I remember I didn't buy his argument. I didn't use it. And when he asked me about it the next time I saw it, I explained my thinking. He's like, "You're wrong, but that's okay." And then he started talking about college basketball again. But the other thing I it's been said, it's been implied, I'm going to say it again. I never saw John more happy than when he was talking about his family. And that was always a pleasure. I wish I had a drink to John.
Thanks. First of all, I want to apologize to John because he and I spent the last 40 years watching the games during this thing, drinking. Sorry, John. Laura made me come to this. I should be watching a basketball game. I'm sure you're ashamed of me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jim Collins. And John and I bonded over lots of different things. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Burley Hendrickson, and I did not know John nearly as well as many of the people in this room, but I just wanted to report that Duke has lost by 13 points, and we shared in common. I was a UNC guy, and he was the Michigan guy. We watched some college basketball together at these things and drank beer, and I was just a grad student, nobody, who wasn't really working directly with him, and he didn't care. He just wanted to drink beer and remind me that he was not pro-Carolina. He really didn't like UNC, and I reminded him about the 1993 timeout thing and how we won and et cetera, and how that was great. But we shared this hatred of Duke. I'm anti-Duke, and by the way, my buddy is the president over there, and I just want him to know how much Duke sucks. So I thought that he would really appreciate that they have now lost. We share that in common. And now I have a position, and I'm now really enjoying getting to know his work better. I've been teaching Agony of the Republic, which is timeless, and my students love it. And I assign alongside that the Gopnik piece that Carolyn's mentioned in as an example of, well, we love that you referenced in it positively, but he sort of takes John's book to task a little bit. So me and my class ripped the critique of John's work collectively, and he leaves out the nuances by saying that he's taking too much of a side of the uprising and not criticizing the violence, from the left extremism, yet left out in his critique of John the nuance that you guys brought up in terms of the Catholic priests that maybe weren't so bad after all. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated his humanity in treating us all like equals, and I'll drink a beer and watch some hoops for him tonight.
So I wasn't going to say anything. I think I've just had some ideas while people were speaking. But I had asked Jennifer if we could maybe show a video, because during the memorial we showed him talking, and this is actually not him talking, but it's Peter McPhee, one of his best friends in the world, who actually flew from Melbourne to Montana, which was pretty amazing, to honor my dad. And my dad was incredibly moved, and I'd just like you guys to see it before I make my comments. And also to introduce you guys to just the clip in general, because his comments are super moving too. So they're later on in the clip.
I hope this is going to work.
Yeah. And it's just nice to see him too.
Next up, we have Peter McPhee, who's come all the way from University of Melbourne.
Let me see. I'm just going to see if I can get the sound in the right place.
I can also, do you want me to make my comments in the...
Nope, I just have to change it to the Chrastil, and we should be good to go. I'm not really tech support. So, let's see. All right, let's try again.
You'll see many familiar faces.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. We're not going to get witty. So June 1974, my first day in the Archives Nationales, I was doing a PhD on the region around Roussillon. In those pre-digital days, your first day in the National Archives was a very intimidating experience. I was suffering, and I was waiting in the lobby to go in. You had to get there very early in those days. A kindly older American scholar, I thought quite an elderly man, saw my discomfort and started chatting to me in a very nice way. One of his former students then came over and joined us, and I was introduced to John Merriman. Actually, the kindly older American scholar who introduced us was none other than Charles Tilley, who I now realise was all of 45. He seemed a very wise person, but of course Chuck, as we knew him, became a great friend and mentor of John's. But it was the start of a very important friendship and relationship in my life. Within a few weeks, John was sitting on the beach with me in Corrières, near Perpignan. We were sort of passing backwards and forwards. Roger Price's book on listening to Republic, sort of taking it in turns to do a critique, and it was the start of a very rich friendship which has lasted over 45 years in Corrières, many times in Balazuk, protracted periods of time that John spent in Melbourne, where he's developed a great love of Australian football, as he does with most things you can do at all. An extraordinarily important friendship for me. We're in touch almost every day. Early on in that friendship, I visited John at Brantford and was stunned, as other people here have been to see the way he worked. I walked into his study. He had this was a long time ago, he had a typewriter on his lap and a pile of note cards covered in that indecipherable writing of his as he was tapping away. But he also had the Rolling Stones at high volume, and he was watching a game of American football at the same time. And I've never seen anything like this sort of this whirlwind. He assured me that if he was only doing one thing at a time, he'd be just thoroughly bored. John and I sort of diverged in our historical interests. He went forward into the 19th century and worked on anarchism and the so-called Belle Epoque and so on, and became even more anti-establishment than when I first knew him. He forgave me for crossing over the dark side and becoming a provost, but also moving back to the French Revolution. But we've always kept reading each other's work, because we share in common what you've already heard about John, his great passion for understanding the lives of ordinary people, his love of place. He's the only person I know who's worked in every departmental archive in France, and as well as that, can tell you the restaurant he ate in afterwards. It's one of the reasons why French colleagues have such a high regard for this man, because he has that natural interest in other people, but also he has a deep intimacy with this place that he loves so much and about which he's taught us so much. John is a person with three great passions, of course. His love of Michigan football, I think, probably comes third, followed by number two would be his love of France and Balazuk in particular, but above all is the love of his family. He's much missed Carol and his two children, Christopher and Laura, who are here with us today and who I have known since they were born, and the affection that they have for each other, which has never been so important as it has been over the last couple of years, is a great example to us all. So, John, like everybody else here, I'm deeply fortunate to have been your friend and to have learned from you so much. It's an honour in every way to be associated with you. Thank you, dear friend.
Rachel and Miranda, you're on the screen, you're here. And Judith, yes, everybody's there. I'm going to try to switch us back to the other.
You're playing that. Okay. So my dad would always, as Peter says, scribble just a couple random words. He loved to use the word random on a note card, and then he would never look at it once, ever. And he'd say, I don't even know why I'm writing this, because I already know what I'm going to say. And so I think someone had said about stories, I think Josh, stories that my dad would have liked people here to know. I've heard, my brother and I've gotten the chance to hear a lot of stories over the past few months. And one, it was someone he went to college with who said that they were in the same fraternity, and he would be in the basement with my dad, and people would pay him to write their papers, and he would be balancing a typewriter on his knees while also winning at poker. The other thing, some of these are just unbelievable. Like I think other people will agree, he just made things look easy, you know, like just working constantly, writing books, multitasking. Also, apparently he once ran a 5K barefoot and won. So I ran a 5K and I thought I was going to throw up the whole time. So I don't know how he did that, especially barefoot. And then he also claimed that he did only 2 months of research for his thesis, and that he wrote it in 2 weeks, and that the words were falling off the page at the end, and that he just handed it in because then he was going traveling around Europe with Dick and Sid Baxter, and he just couldn't wait to get on the road. So also he just, as a father, delighted us with his strong affection and how loving he was, his humor, his joie de vivre, and just he would take us places. I remember he took me to Italy for 2 weeks with my mom. We drove all over, although the whole time he was saying how anything she said, oh, Italy's so mountainous, France is more mountainous. Like it was always, it had to be a competition, and he had to say how awful the food was in Italy, and you know, you know, and then we were driving near Pisa, and he just really wanted me to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and so took a detour. And so he was very much about just, especially more and more through the years as he got older, and especially after my mom died, just bringing us places. And he would say, you know, that hotel was okay, but the fact that you loved it so much, that's why he was so happy. And I remember a few months before his death, he got a check from Norden, and he said, he emailed us right away, and he said, let's spend it all on 5-star restaurants. And we were, unfortunately, we didn't, but my brother and I'm sure we still will. And so one thing, just on a more serious note, so this was actually, I was so happy, he wanted me to go to every single one of his lectures, you know, and I didn't go. It was a little early for me. I'm kind of a night owl. And finally, I just happened to be in New Haven, and I went to his last lecture, and I took that picture while he was walking back to his office on High Street, the first street we lived on when he was the master of Branford. And it was actually his last day teaching in person. So I was really glad to capture that. There was a very magic element to him, and he just really wanted to teach forever. He said he was 36 for about 10 years, then finally I think he turned 37, but he was furious with my mom for making him write a will. You know, he was always going to live. And then when he got, you know, he had kind of small health things that seemed not serious, and we would say, oh, it's fine, Dad, it's fine. And he was very kind of always worried about medical things, and oh, no. If I could just live 10 more years, I'll be happy, you know? And so that's what I wanted to say. He loved life. He loved you all so much. It just meant the world to him. He wishes he were here. And just thank you for enriching his life.
Well, oh, you want to go ahead? please, let's get the microphone.
This is just super fast. I just had a response to the other. Thank you, Laura. That was beautiful. I just had two quick things to say. I didn't mean to say that John would not have commented on the rugby France 53 to England 10 score. He would know all about that and know all the other results of all the other sports that his colleagues cared about too. I was thinking you were asking about his activism. I still remember all the stories about how he protested the shuttering of Les Halles as a market. He actually went and walked and protested. So he certainly took to the streets sometimes. I don't know all those stories, but I know that story. And that was just, I always was so, every time I lecture about Les Halles, I still tell that story. It really struck me at the time. And the last thing was, Miranda, your story about the chapter. I got back from my research and I just was hiding from him because I didn't know how to start writing. And after about 2.5 months, he crossed paths with me in a hallway, light touch, right? He said, I don't think I've received anything from you since you've come back from your research. What about you give me like 10 pages, say in 2 weeks? And I gave him 80. But that's what he did. He didn't put pressure, but somehow he unleashed the floodgates. So I just wanted to see that.
This could go on forever, but I'm going to add one thing, which is in terms of encouraging writing. So I wrote an undergraduate thesis, and John said, you should publish this. Send it to French Historical Studies. So I was a senior in college. I sent it to French Historical Studies, and I was off working in Indonesia and Singapore, and I got something back saying that they were interested, but they did not publish 80-page articles, even written by students from Yale. So I didn't know any better. So I ended up being back in Washington, D.C. at home, and I think I must have, I don't know if I called John, I probably wrote him a letter. I think those were the days when you wrote letters and put them in mailboxes. But in any case, I told him about this response, and he got on it immediately, and he said, and it was kind of clear to him that I was living at home, I was kind of lost, I wasn't working on this, and he said, come up to New Haven and I'll give you a room in Branford and you can use the library. And my mother said, well, if your professor at Yale is suggesting this, I think you should do it. So I got on the train, I went to New Haven, and I was in the library. He gave me an apartment in Branford and got me to write, to work on this thing, and he read the comments, and then I ended up publishing it. And he just anyway, that your story just reminded me of that.
Well, good. I think we've said lots of things that are worth thinking about, and I don't know, made me feel better hearing everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Laura, too, for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
I forgot to say that he wanted to teach forever, too. I said, just do it on Zoom at least. It was like, no, it had to be a friend. Even when he was really sick, he was still, finally he said, maybe we